She limped up to the gate covered in mud and bruises, and a rookie MP shoved her back like she was nobody. He had no idea he'd just laid hands on a decorated combat pilot carrying intel that could expose a traitor inside his own command. What happened in the next 10 seconds changed his entire career. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The heat at White Ridge Air Force Base sat on the tarmac like a physical weight, thick enough to bend the horizon into a shimmering lie. It was a Tuesday afternoon pushing 103 degrees, and the air smelled of jet fuel, hot asphalt, and the faint ozone tang that always followed a storm system rolling east across the desert. For Major Renata Cruz, the oppressive heat was almost a comfort. It was dry. It didn't seep into her boots the way the freezing mud of the extraction zone in the Baltic Corridor had, 3 days and 1 lifetime ago. She had not slept in over 60 hours. Not real sleep, the kind with dreams, the kind that let a person forget for a while. She had flown 2 consecutive close air support sorties in an F-16 that came home with more shrapnel scoring than paint, watched her wingman's canopy take a hit that shouldn't have been survivable, and then spent 11 hours on a cargo transport with her knees against a stack of classified crates because there hadn't been a proper seat. She did not look like one of the most decorated fighter pilots in her wing. She looked like a woman who had lost a fight with a ditch. She wore a borrowed flight line coverall 2 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled into thick cuffs at her wrists. Her boots were crusted with mud that had long since dried to the color of rust. A bruise the size of a fist bloomed along her jaw, and she walked with the flat, careful gait of someone protecting a rib that wasn't broken yet but wanted to be. All she needed was to cross 400 yards of tarmac, deliver a sealed data case to the wing commander, and collapse. The checkpoint stood in her way. Corporal Wade Tillman was 22 years old, 11 months out of tech school, and he wore his uniform with the starched, humorless precision of a man who had never once had to make a decision that mattered. He liked the gate. He liked the yellow line painted into the concrete, the way people stopped when he raised his hand, the small clean authority of it. He had a partner that afternoon, Staff Sergeant Denise Okafor, a woman with 14 years in and the particular tiredness of someone who had trained 100 Tillmans and would train 100 more. She was leaning in the shade of the guard shack, half watching the road, when she saw the woman in the oversized coverall come around a maintenance hangar and start toward the gate with a limp that made Okafor straighten up without quite knowing why. Tillman saw her too. He drew his own conclusions fast, the way young men in uniforms with new authority tend to. "Ma'am, hold up." He stepped out from the shack, one palm raised flat, chest already squared like a man bracing for a fight he'd already decided he'd win. "This is a restricted flight line. You need to head back to the visitor center." Renata stopped at the boundary. Every muscle in her legs was screaming at her to sit down, anywhere, even the hot pavement. She took a slow breath before she answered, because she did not trust her voice not to crack from exhaustion rather than fear, and she did not want it read as fear. "I need to get to wing ops," she said. Her throat was raw from 3 days of smoke and adrenaline. "I have clearance. I just need to scan through." Tillman's eyes went over her, the dried mud, the ill-fitting coverall, the bruised jaw, and something in his face settled into satisfaction, the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has correctly identified a problem. "Wing Ops is a Level 4 facility, ma'am. You don't scan into a Level 4 building looking like you slept under a bridge. Where's your ID? Your sponsor?" "I'm not a dependent," Renata said, flat. She reached into the coverall's chest pocket, fingers brushing the hard corner of the sealed case beneath the zipper. "My CAC was lost in transit. I have temporary travel orders from Joint Task Force Command." She pulled out a folded, heavily stamped sheet of paper, creased soft from being carried against her body for 2 days. It wasn't a standard visitor pass. It was a crisis transit authorization, the kind issued to personnel moving under classified orders when normal channels broke down. Tillman didn't look at it. He looked at her boots. "I don't care what that paper says, ma'am. Standard protocol is a physical CAC or an escorting officer. Step back behind the line. Behind him, Okafor had gone still in the way that meant she was paying very close attention. She knew the difference between someone lost and someone who had just come out of something. This woman had the second kind of stillness, the 1,000-yard patience of a person who had learned, recently and badly, exactly how much worse things could get than a rude corporal at a gate. Tillman, Okafor said, low. Run the barcode. Just run it. I've got this, Sergeant. He didn't look away from Renata. He liked the way she wasn't flinching, it read to him as defiance, and defiance was something he knew how to punish. Renata felt the seconds bleeding away. The case in her pocket held targeting data on a mobile air defense system that had ambushed her flight, a system that shouldn't have had the tracking solution it had, not without help. Every minute she spent arguing with a corporal was a minute that data sat undelivered while people downrange remained exposed to whatever had fed the enemy her flight path. Corporal, she said, and her voice dropped, went level and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. It was the voice she used on a radio when the words had to land exactly once. Scan the paper. If you don't, this is going to be the worst afternoon of your career, and I promise you it won't be close. Tillman's face flushed. He was young enough that a threat from an exhausted woman in a stolen coverall registered as an insult rather than a warning. His hand drifted, almost lazily, to rest on the grip of his sidearm, not drawing, just a show, the kind of gesture that was supposed to end an argument by itself. Last warning, he said. Behind the line, hands where I can see them. Tillman, Okafor started, already moving. He reached out and shoved Renata's shoulder, not hard, not by his own accounting, just enough to move a civilian who wasn't listening. It happened to be her bad shoulder. And it happened to a body that had spent 3 days operating entirely on reflex. She didn't stumble. She caught his wrist, turned half a step, and had his hand pinned harmlessly against his own chest before either of them had fully registered what her body had decided to do without asking her permission. It wasn't violent. It was economical, the kind of motion trained into muscle so many times it no longer required thought, and it stopped as soon as it started. Don't, Renata said quietly, touch me. Okafor was already moving between them, one hand up. Tillman, back off. Back off now. Renata let go of his wrist the instant he stopped resisting. She wasn't interested in a fight. She was interested in getting through a gate. She reached into the collar of the coverall and pulled out a chain she'd worn under her flight suit for 6 years, the one thing she had refused to leave behind even when her gear bag went missing somewhere over the Atlantic. At the end of it hung a hardened leather credential wallet, the kind issued to combat aircrew carrying sensitive material. She flipped it open and held it flat against Tillman's chest. Read it. He looked down. Command pilot wings that a distinguished flying cross with an oak leaf cluster. A red striped clearance card that meant her access didn't route through a gate corporal's judgment call, not ever. The name in block letters, Cruz, Renata, Major, USAF, Command Pilot. The color left his face in stages, like a light dimming. Major Cruz, he said, and the word came out smaller than he meant it to. His hand fell away from his holster as though it had gone hot. Okafor exhaled something that was almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it, just relief that the last 30 seconds hadn't ended somewhere worse. You wanted a sponsor, Corporal. Renata said, and there was no triumph in it, only bone-deep tiredness. My sponsor is the mission. Scan the paper. Okafor took it from her hand without a word and fed it under the scanner in the shack. The reader chirped once, then flashed amber and let out 3 sharp tones, a priority override most gate personnel never saw outside of training. The heavy vehicle barrier sank into the pavement. The pedestrian turnstile released and locked open. Tillman stood frozen on the yellow line, doing the math on how many years of his career he'd just spent in 30 seconds. Renata didn't gloat. She didn't have the energy for it, and it wasn't in her anyway. She stepped through the open turnstile, then paused and looked back at him. Corporal Tillman. He straightened like he'd been shocked. Next time someone tells you they have clearance, look at their eyes. Not their laundry. Then she turned and started the long, limping walk toward wing operations, leaving the checkpoint in a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to have stopped to watch. The walk to the headquarters building felt longer than the transatlantic flight that had brought her home. The adrenaline that had carried her through the gate was already draining out of her, leaving the raw ache of a body that had been asking for a hospital bed for 2 days and had been repeatedly told no. She pushed through the glass doors of the headquarters building into a wall of air conditioning that hit her like cold water. The lobby was all polished floors and glass trophy cases, a shrine to a squadron's history that felt, at that moment, like it belonged to a different, gentler world than the one she'd just come from. A young airman at the front desk half rose from his chair. "Ma'am, you can't." She set the leather wallet on his desk without breaking stride. He looked at the red stripe and sat back down without another word. Colonel Marcus Reyes was standing at the window of his office when she came in, a mug of coffee going cold in his hand. He'd flown 2 wars himself, long enough ago that his hair had gone the color of gunmetal, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had learned to read a person's condition in a single glance. "Major Cruz." His voice was a low rasp. "I was told you were en route. I didn't expect you to skip the hospital to get here." "No time, sir." She crossed to his desk and set down a small hardened case, the metal clicking against the glass top. "Full telemetry and radar signature data from the engagement. It's all there." He looked at the case, then at her bruised jaw, and something in his expression tightened. "Sit down before you fall down, Major. I need to know about Halvorsen." Her voice cracked on the name, Captain Eric Halvorsen, her wingman, whose canopy had taken a hit that should not have been survivable. "I saw the impact. I saw the medevac." Reyes rubbed the bridge of his nose. "He's at Landstuhl. Stable. 2 days out of surgery, but the surgeons say he'll fly again eventually. You bought him that with how you flew the recovery, Renata. Don't forget that." Something in her chest loosened, just slightly, the first full breath she'd taken since the missile warning tone had screamed in her headset 3 days earlier. "It wasn't a normal engagement, sir," she said, and her voice hardened again, the exhaustion burning off under something colder. "We were briefed the corridor was clear except for light small arms fire. Instead we flew straight into a mobile air defense system with a locked solution before we even crested the ridge. That system had no business tracking us that precisely. Someone gave them our ingress vector." Reyes's face went very still. "You're saying this was a leak?" "I'm saying somebody either sold our flight plan or altered it after it was sealed. I want it run down. Today." He didn't argue. He picked up the case and moved toward the door. "Then let's find out who." The secure facility 2 floors below wing operations was a windowless vault humming with server racks and cold air. Special Agent Priyanandi of the Office of Special Investigations was already waiting when Reyes and Renata came down, along with Technical Sergeant Cole Ashby, the wing's senior intelligence analyst. Nandi was compact, precise, and unreadable, the kind of investigator who lets silence do most of her work. She watched Renata settle stiffly into a chair and did not comment on the bruising, which Renata appreciated more than she would have expected. "Walk me through the engagement," Nandi said, clicking her pen. Renata did, the ridge, the sudden lock tone, the missile that came in with a targeting solution too clean to be luck. As she spoke, Ashby pulled the mission's routing file and threw it up on the wall display, a topographic map of the corridor, the flight path traced in green, and 2 small red icons marking the enemy system's position, locked precisely onto the aircraft's line before they'd even crossed the ridge. "That's the problem," Ashby said, tapping the screen. "A system like that doesn't sit powered up and pre-aimed on a corridor by accident. If their search radar had been active earlier, our early warning aircraft would have flagged it from 60 miles out. It stayed dark. It waited. Which means somebody told them exactly when and where to look." "Who built the routing?" Renata asked. Ashby checked the metadata. Came down from Joint Task Force Command, but the final approach corridor, the actual line you flew, was finalized and signed off locally. He paused, scrolling. By a liaison officer attached to Ground Command. Name, Nandi said. Ashby read it off the screen, and the room went very quiet. Major Diego Cruz. Renata's stomach dropped through the floor. Diego was her husband, an intelligence liaison stationed forward, a man who had spent the last 4 years of their marriage explaining, patiently, exactly why a strike aircraft could not survive certain classes of air defense systems. He knew what an unmarked mobile SAM battery could do to an F-16. He would never, not in any version of himself she had ever known, route her into one on purpose. That's not possible, she said. His cryptographic key authorized the final file, Ashby said carefully, not unkindly. But there's a discrepancy. The file shows a modification timestamp 3 minutes after it was logged as sealed and locked. Someone used his access after the fact, Renata said immediately. Diego didn't do this. Nandi's expression didn't change, but her voice, when it came, was careful in the particular way of someone delivering news she already suspected would not be welcome. Major, I understand this is difficult to hear, but as of 6 hours ago, your husband missed a scheduled briefing and hasn't been located. Given the digital trail and his absence, protocol requires us to consider both possibilities, that he was compromised, or that he's responsible. He's not responsible, Renata said, and there was no doubt in it at all, only certainty forged from 4 years of knowing exactly the kind of man she'd married. If someone stole his access to set this up, and he found out, he wouldn't sit still for a briefing. He'd go find out who did it. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. You think he's running down the leak himself? I think if he suspected the network was compromised and he didn't have a clean way to warn anyone without tipping off whoever was inside, he'd find another way to leave a signal. She looked at Ashby. Pull the raw routing file. Not the summary, the actual data blocks for the altered waypoints. Ashby glanced at Reyes, got a nod, and brought up a wall of dense alphanumeric code. Diego used to embed hidden strings in low-priority metadata when we were stationed together, a habit from his crypto training, half game, half insurance policy. If he touched this file after it was compromised, even under duress, he might have left something. Ashby ran a differential scan against the packet headers on the altered coordinates. A few seconds later he sat up straighter. There's an anomaly in the parity bits. It's not random, there's a repeating structural pattern. Somebody embedded a secondary signal inside the routing data. Isolate it, Renata said. Decrypt it. It took less than a minute. The wall display cleared, and a single line of plain text appeared where the code had been. Archive compromised. They have the project data. Going dark to find the source. Trust no one at command. The leak is internal. Find the broker. D. The room was silent for a long moment. He's alive, Renata breathed. He's not a defector. He's hunting whoever did this. What archive? Nandi asked, sharper now. Reyes exhaled slowly, looking older than he had 5 minutes earlier. There's a classified countermeasure program, call it the Sentinel Archive. Software designed to let our aircraft dynamically defeat enemy tracking systems in real time. It's still developmental. If someone stole the framework, they wouldn't just have a weapon. They'd have the blueprint for defeating our aircraft's defenses across the board. That's why the ambush worked without active search radar, Renata said, cold clarity settling over her exhaustion like a second skin. They weren't just shooting at us. Someone was testing the archive's counter logic in reverse, using our own flight data to prove it worked. Nandi's jaw tightened. If a private buyer gets a working copy of that framework, every airframe we fly becomes findable. Diego found the breach, Renata said, piecing it together at the speed she used to fly. He started asking questions. Whoever's selling it panicked, used his credentials to route me into a live fire test, and let his absence look like a defection. 2 problems solved for them: kill the pilot who'd dispute the after-action report, and frame the man onto whoever leaked it. Ashby had already pulled up a secondary search, cross-referencing broker against known contractors with clearance to the archive's original development team. A single file populated the screen, a photograph of a heavy-set man in his 60s with cold, careful eyes. Everett Kessler, Ashby read. Former lead systems architect on the original program. Quietly separated from the contract 18 months ago after an internal audit flagged irregular data transfers. Current residence, he paused, is a private estate about 20 miles from here. 20 miles, Reyes repeated. He's local. Then Diego's coming here, Renata said, already on her feet despite every joint in her body protesting. He's not chasing a lead overseas. He's closing in. Nandi reached for her radio. I'll mobilize a tactical response. No. Renata's hand closed over her wrist before she could key the mic. If there's a leak inside this command's network, broadcasting a raid puts a warning in Kessler's hands before your team clears the gate. He wipes everything and vanishes, and Diego walks into whatever's left alone. Before Nandi could respond, the overhead lights flickered violently and died. The steady hum of the server racks cut out, replaced a half-second later by the rising whine of emergency backup power. Dim red emergency lighting bled across the room. Ashby swore, hammering at his keyboard. We just lost the primary uplink. Somebody severed the external lines. We're also eating a denial of service attack on the internal network. Reyes grabbed the hardline phone on the wall, listened, and slammed it back down. Dead. They know, Renata said quietly, adrenaline burning through the exhaustion like sunlight through fog. They know I brought the data back. They know we're decrypting it right now. A deep mechanical groan rolled through the vault as the blast door's magnetic seals disengaged with a shriek of overridden hydraulics. They're not just locking us in, Renata said, already moving toward cover. They're coming through that door. Reyes didn't waste time arguing. He hit the cipher lock on the emergency weapons locker bolted into the vault wall while Ashby yanked the data drive from its port and shoved it into a cargo pocket, then killed the terminal with a zeroization command that would fry the drives beyond recovery. Reyes tossed Nandi a carbine and slid a sidearm across the table to Renata, who caught it and thumbed the safety off in the same motion, the weight of it grounding her in a way nothing else had in 3 days. Behind the racks, Nandi ordered, taking cover behind a support pillar. Doors coming down. A white-hot line of sparks bloomed around the seam of the blast door, a thermal breaching lance, not a standard tool, cutting through hardened steel with methodical patience. Private contractors, Nandi said grimly. Somebody sent a cleanup team. The door came in with a concussive crack. 3 figures in unmarked tactical gear surged through the smoke, weapons up. Nandi fired first, 2 controlled shots dropping the lead man before he'd found a target. The remaining 2 opened up, chewing through the overturned conference table and sparking off the server housings. Renata ducked behind the rack, breathed once through the pain in her ribs, and leaned out to put 2 rounds into the nearest attacker's shoulder and chest. Reyes finished the third with a short burst from the carbine. Silence, except for the hum of the backup generator and brass rolling across the floor. Clear, Nandi called, already moving to check the fallen men. Sanitized gear, no ID, professional. They've sealed the stairwell and the elevator, Ashby reported, checking a jamming device on one of the bodies. There's a second team topside. Then we don't go topside, Renata said, eyes on an access grate set into the floor in the corner of the vault, a maintenance tunnel for the base's fiber infrastructure, running toward the motor pool half a mile away. Reyes and Ashby stayed behind to secure the vault and get a landline call out through backup channels. Nandi took point in the tunnel, with Renata close behind, crawling through dust and heat on bruised knees, refusing to let the pain slow her down. They emerged near the motor pool to find 2 more guards pacing the garage floor, unaware their SCIF team had already failed. Nandi improvised a short in the power junction with a coin from her pocket, blowing the overhead lights and covering their approach in the resulting confusion. 2 quiet shots later, the garage was clear, and an unmarked SUV sat waiting with the engine still running, the extraction vehicle the mercenary team had planned to leave in. "You should stay," Nandi said, sliding into the driver's seat. "Not a chance," Renata answered, already in the passenger side. "That's my husband out there." The drive into the hills outside the base was silent and fast. Kessler's estate sat behind high walls on a ridge overlooking the desert, dark and powerless, its perimeter lighting and camera towers dead. "Someone's already inside," Nandi said, killing the headlights a quarter-mile out and switching to night optics. They went in on foot, scaling a low section of the perimeter wall using a stacked retaining wall as a ladder. The first sound that reached them was gunfire, sharp, controlled return fire answering a chaotic burst from an upper balcony. Nandi flanked wide, taking down a shooter on the balcony with 2 suppressed rounds before he ever registered the threat. Renata moved low across the courtyard toward the sound of the fight, every step a negotiation with her battered body, until she found him. Major Diego Cruz was pinned behind a low stone wall near the courtyard's dry fountain, blood soaking through the sleeve of a torn shirt, a compact pistol in his hand and a hard drive clutched under his other arm. He spun at the sound of her approach, weapon rising, and froze the instant he recognized her. "Renata." His voice cracked. "You're supposed to be in a hospital bed in Germany. You're supposed to be at a briefing table in Ramstein," she shot back, sliding into cover beside him, a fierce, exhausted grin breaking through the bruising on her face. "We know about the archive. We know Kessler set the ambush up to test it. I pulled the source data before he could finish the transfer," Diego said, tapping the drive. "He's got a buyer lined up. He's trying to get to a vehicle in the underground garage." "Not tonight, he isn't," Renata said. The 3 of them moved together, Nandi taking point through a side door into the garage, where Everett Kessler stood frozen beside an armored SUV, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the door handle. "Step away from the vehicle," Nandi ordered, weapon leveled. Kessler turned, and whatever composure he'd built across 2 decades of contracts and clearances collapsed the moment he saw the 3 people standing in front of him. "You don't understand," he said. "The program was going to be shelved. I had buyers who saw its real value. I was going to fund the next generation myself. You put a live missile system on a corridor to test your software," Renata said, and her voice was steel. "You nearly killed my wingman. You tried to frame my husband for treason. That ends here." Kessler sank slowly to his knees, hands laced behind his head. Nandi moved in and cuffed him, reciting his rights in a flat, professional cadence while the desert wind moved through the open garage door. Diego reached over and pulled Renata gently against him, careful of her ribs. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. She let herself lean into him for the first time in 3 days, the drive in his hand a small, solid weight against the enormity of what it had cost to get here. "Let's go home," she said. Kessler was sentenced to life under federal espionage statutes, the case sealed from public record but quietly circulated through every intelligence briefing that touched the Sentinel program for the next 2 years. The archive itself was rebuilt from the ground up with new safeguards, and the audit that followed it uncovered 2 smaller leaks that might otherwise have gone unnoticed for years. Diego's name was cleared within the week, his clearance quietly restored along with a formal apology that neither of them cared much about by then. He spent the better part of a month in a debrief room answering questions he'd already answered twice, patient in the particular way of a man who understood that the system's caution, however maddening, was the same caution that had eventually cleared him. Captain Halvorsen came off the ventilator 11 days later. It took him longer to walk than to breathe on his own, and longer still to fly than to walk, but 6 months after the ambush he stood on the flight line in a fresh flight suit, signed for his aircraft, and took off into a clear morning sky while half the squadron watched from the tarmac without pretending not to. Special Agent Nandi closed the case file personally, over Renata's quiet objection that she didn't need to be thanked for doing her job. Nandi thanked her anyway, in the clipped, understated way of someone who rarely said more than she meant. "You made the call in that server room when I would have made the wrong one," Nandi told her once, months later, over coffee neither of them had time to finish. "I'd have broadcast the raid. You'd both be dead if I had." Renata didn't argue the point. She'd flown enough missions to know that being right once didn't make a person right the next time, and she carried that lesson back into the cockpit with her, the way she carried most things, quietly, and without much interest in being told she'd done well. Corporal Wade Tillman kept his post at the gate. He was never written up, never formally disciplined beyond a long, uncomfortable conversation with his shift supervisor that he didn't discuss with anyone afterward. But the story of the woman he'd nearly detained, the one he'd shoved, the one who turned out to be carrying data that cracked open a treason case, followed him around the base for a long time. It became something told in break rooms and guard shacks in the months that followed, half warning and half parable, whenever a young MP got a little too sure of what a uniform, or the lack of one, was supposed to tell him about the person standing in front of it. Tillman himself changed, in small ways nobody but Okafor really noticed. He ran barcodes now without being told to, and he'd stopped assuming the worst about anyone who didn't look the part. Renata Cruz went back to flying within the month, over the objections of a flight surgeon who wanted another 2 weeks and lost that argument the way flight surgeons usually lost arguments with her. She never mentioned the checkpoint again, not once, not even to Diego, who heard the story secondhand from Reyes long before she ever brought it up herself. She didn't need to tell it. It had already made the rounds without her, passed from guard shack to guard shack the way the best and worst stories on any base always did, a little exaggerated at the edges, but true enough where it counted, about a woman nobody had recognized until the moment it mattered most, and about how much could go wrong, or right, in the space of 30 seconds at a checkpoint under the Arizona sun.